Magovan and Melanin. Well met, my friends, and welcome back to Of Hobbits and Heaven. My name is Caitlin, and today we're going to be looking at The Hobbit. Let's start by discussing Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo is very much like us. He is a gentleman, or I should say a gentle hobbit, and seeks a respectable life. Tolkien says, "This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins." People considered the Bagginses very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. Bilbo likes his nice clothes and good food, and is dedicated to his easy life. He is initially unwilling to give up this easy life and take up his cross. And then who should come along but the wizard Gandalf? Gandalf wants to remove Bilbo from his comforts to make him a better hobbit by forcing him to grow past himself. He tells Bilbo, "In fact, I will go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you." Bilbo has to learn to love and self-sacrifice, giving up himself for the good of others. He hates it for the first half of the story, and often says something along the lines of, "I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire, with the kettle just beginning to sing." In fact, he says this no less than 7 times over the course of the book. It is worth noting that the last time he says this is before going to face Smaug for the first time, which is when Bilbo fully grows into the hobbit that Gandalf knew he could become, able to love and sacrifice for others. In the first chapter, An Unexpected Party, Bilbo learns about the dragon Smaug, who has stolen the kingdom of Erebor and destroyed its neighboring kingdom, Dale. Tolkien tells us of the horror and greed of dragons, who destroy everything that is beautiful and pure. He says, "Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it." He used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale, and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale was ruined and all the people dead or gone. Dragon sickness happens when someone becomes enslaved to their possessions, and is a warning to us about the dangers of greed. As the Gospel of Matthew chapter 6 verse 21 says, "For where your treasure is, there also will your heart be." We must store our treasures in heaven, not on earth. This is one of the main Christian themes in The Hobbit, but it is also brought up again in The Lord of the Rings. Pippin, who, along with Merry, had been captured by the Uruk-hai, cast aside his elven brooch from Laurelin in the hopes that Aragorn, a skilled tracker, would be able to find it and know that they were still alive. When Aragorn returns the brooch, Pippin tells him that it was a wrench to let it go, to which Aragorn replies, "One who cannot cast away a treasure at need is in fetters." Smaug, of course, is an obvious example of the dragon sickness. Once the company reaches Erebor, the dwarves send Bilbo into the mountain to scope out the dragon's hoard. He steals a small cup for the dwarves while Smaug is asleep. Smaug, upon waking, immediately realizes that the cup is missing, and his rage passes description, the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had, but have never before used or wanted. Smaug, in his pride, later shows off his waistcoat of diamonds to Bilbo and boasts of his invincibility. But there is a weak spot in his armor, directly above his heart, which symbolizes that his weakness, his greed, is of the heart. After talking with Bilbo, Smaug smashes the side of the mountain, and the dwarves are trapped inside. The dwarves despair because they have fallen into pride, but Bilbo feels a strange lightening of the heart, because he has learned humility. Pierce says, "Despair is a sin because it is the denial of the theological virtue of hope. It is inextricably connected to pride." After smashing the mountain, Smaug travels to Lake Town, where the dwarves had stayed before coming to Erebor. A thrush had heard Bilbo tell the dwarves of the weakness in Smaug's armor, and he in turn tells Bard the bowman. As Smaug is attacking, the moon rises at exactly the right time to illuminate the exposed part of the dragon's body, and Bard kills the dragon with his last arrow. The light of the moon is the light of grace, and the failure of Smaug's wicked heart to respond to this grace shows that Smaug has died a spiritual death. Bilbo is also an example of dragon sickness, but to a lesser, more relatable degree. At the beginning of the story, Bilbo is self-centered and unwilling to sacrifice the comforts of home to help the dwarves reclaim their homeland. Bilbo is freed from his dragon sickness over the course of his journey, through sacrifice and love. Smaug, however, is ultimately killed by his own sickness. The battle against the dragon is the war against wickedness that we fight every day. Pierce says, "We must either fight the dragons that we encounter in life or become dragons ourselves. There is no comfortable alternative." Thorin is heavily affected by the dragon sickness, and the fall of the dragon only makes it worse. The people of Lake Town, whose home was destroyed by Smaug, come to the lonely mountain seeking aid. Thorin refuses to part with any of the gold and instead insistently looks for the Arkenstone, or the King's Jewel. Thorin says, "The Arkenstone of my father is worth more than a river of gold in itself, and to me it is beyond price. That stone of all the treasure I name unto myself, and I will be avenged on anyone who finds it and withholds it." Bilbo says, "The whole place stinks of dragon, and it makes me sick." Bilbo here is referring both to the literal stink of the dragon and to the stink of greed that has settled on the company. Thorin has become the dragon that he set out to slay. In order to save the dwarves from Thorin's greed, Bilbo takes the Arkenstone to the elves and the Lake Town people for them to barter with Thorin. He tells Bard and the Elf King Thranduil, "I assure you, Thorin is quite ready to sit on a heap of gold and starve as long as you sit here." As Bilbo is leaving, he runs into Gandalf, who approves wholeheartedly. "Well done, Mr. Baggins," he said, clapping Bilbo on the back. "There is always more about you than anyone expects." It was Gandalf. For the first time for many a day, Bilbo was really delighted. To Bilbo, who has learned humility, Gandalf's approval is worth more than the Arkenstone. But the negotiations fail, and as the armies line up to fight, the goblins arrive, sparking the battle of the 5 armies. It can be confusing what counts as the 5 armies, but the 5 armies are the dwarves, the elves, the men, the goblins, and the wolves. Thorin is mortally wounded in the battle, but before he dies, he reconciles with Bilbo. Bilbo tells him, "This is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves." Thorin responds, "No, there is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom, blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world." Nothing can compensate for Thorin's death, yet Bilbo is glad he came. He has learned that life is a cross to be carried willingly and enthusiastically. The one who embraces suffering and is willing to die for others is happier than those who shun suffering and put themselves first. Thorin, in the end, overcomes his dragon sickness and realizes that friendship and joy are more important than gold. Bilbo returns home in the middle of an estate sale and essentially crashes his own funeral because he had been presumed dead. At the beginning, Bilbo is, in a sense, spiritually dead, but is born again to fuller life through the sacrifices of his quest. The Sackville Bagginses, who are eager to claim the home of Bilbo for themselves, show us what Bilbo would have been without the journey, greedy for his home and riches. Tolkien writes, "Many of his silver spoons mysteriously disappeared and were never accounted for. Personally, he suspected the Sackville Bagginses. On their side, they never admitted that the returned Baggins was genuine, and they were not on friendly terms with Bilbo ever after. They really had wanted to live in his nice hobbit hole so very much." Bilbo has grown to see how small he is, and when Gandalf tells him, "You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you, but you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world after all," Bilbo laughs and says, "Thank goodness." Bilbo no longer really cares what other hobbits think of him, leading many to call him Mad Baggins. Tolkien says, "Indeed, Bilbo found that he had lost more than spoons. He had lost his reputation. It is true that forever after, he remained an elf friend, and had the honor of dwarves, wizards, and all such folk as ever passed that way, but he was no longer quite respectable. He was in fact held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side, but even they were not encouraged in their friendship by their elders. I'm sorry to say he did not mind. He was quite content, and the sound of the kettle on his hearth was ever after more musical than it had been even in the quiet days before the unexpected party. This brings to mind a quote from St. Francis, "Let me be as a fool for Christ." Bilbo's new reputation is not entirely negative. He becomes well known for his generosity. In a conversation at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, Gaffer Gamgee says, "If that's being queer, then we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts. There's some not far away that wouldn't offer a pint of beer to a friend if they lived in a hole with golden walls." But they do things proper at Bag End. Later in the story, as the hobbits and Aragorn pass the old troll cave, Frodo tells Merry that Bilbo gave away the troll's treasure, saying, "He told me once he did not feel it was really his, as it came from robbers." The last theme I want to talk about in The Hobbit is Franciscan simplicity. The first example here is Radagast, who was in the Lord of the Rings book but the Hobbit movies. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien notes that the name Radagast means tender of beasts in Adunaic, the language of the men of Numenor. His original name, Iwendil, means bird friend in Quenya, another of Tolkien's languages. Radagast has a strong and mystical love for wild beasts and natural beings of God's creation. He speaks to the birds, similar to how St. Francis preached to birds. Saruman disdains Radagast as simple and foolish, such as others scorned St. Francis, who became known as God's juggler. Beorn also exhibits Franciscan simplicity with simple wooden tools and a love of nature. As a fun fact, the name Beorn means man or old warrior in Old English, and Bjorn means bear in Old Norse. When the dwarves reach Erebor, they are thrilled with the gold, but Bilbo is quickly bored. He says, "I would give a good many of these precious goblets for a drink of something cheering out of one of Beorn's wooden bowls." The dwarves have dragon sickness, while Bilbo sees beauty in simplicity. This brings us to the end of today's episode. God bless you, and farewell, Namarie.